So yeah, George R. R. Martin came out with a blog update this morning that, in my opinion, just straight up attacks Ryan Condal's decision making on a couple things very specifically, and not even really criticizing the show as a whole or what I think was maybe not a very strong second half to season 2. Nothing really criticizing character development or characterization of, like, say, Daemon or anything like that. That doesn't mean those criticisms are not going to come from George R. R. Martin, but it seems unlikely now because after what he wrote today, somebody must have reached out to him. Something happened because he took that blog update down. And you can tell it's something that he thought about quite a bit. It's rather extensive. I'm going to put it up on the screen if it's not already up so that you guys can read along, or you can pause it and go through it. I'm not going to read through this thing again. But if you want to read it, if you haven't read it yet, pause the video. You can read it here. But I do want to talk about some of the things that are introduced here, because it immediately, the number one thing that jumps out at me, that alarms me, that concerns me, is that George R. R. Martin is not very involved in House of the Dragon. And I'm frustrated with House of the Dragon for a few reasons. I think your general audience, I hope they are enjoying it, because if they're not enjoying it, if your more casual viewers are not enjoying it, show only fans, if they're not enjoying it, then I don't know who the show's for anymore. It's certainly not for those that are a fan of the book material. And that's actually okay, because I actually look at the book material as pretty thin. The only thing I want them to bring over from the books is key plot developments, key plot points. And some of those things are changing, and it's kind of crazy to me because it is so thin that there's so much room for, take some creative liberties here, expand on some of these plot points. Because if you read Fire and Blood, it really does, it dips into some of these scenes like Blood and Cheese, which is what George R. R. Martin really leans into here because of the absence of Maelor. And if you're not familiar, Maelor is Aegon II. It's his youngest son. So you have Jaehaera and Jaehaerys, and those are your twins, right? So we all see that if you watch the show. Ultimately, there is no Sophie's Choice, though. And it's like, well, why would there be Sophie's Choice in this? And maybe you're not familiar with the criticism of Blood and Cheese. The reason why there's so much criticism is because in the source material and the animated material that was in the Game of Thrones bonus features, on the Blu-rays, and if you go all the way back to The Princess and the Queen, in the source material, Maelor, the youngest son, is present, and Helaena has to choose between Maelor or Jaehaerys, and ultimately she names Maelor, the Sophie's Choice element. And the cruelty of the situation is that ultimately Blood and Cheese end up killing Jaehaerys regardless. So Helaena goes on becoming quite depressed and in shock and not really the same person anymore. She can't even look at Maelor anymore because she named him for death. Later on into the story, Maelor is ultimately killed in really brutal fashion. And when word of this gets to Helaena, this is the tipping point, and she ultimately, from what we can read, kills herself. Now, I want to say that they're not doing that in House of the Dragon. I don't know what they're going to do instead, but they are not doing that. At least according to George R. R. Martin, and based on what he understands of the outline provided by Ryan Condal. And this seems to be something that George is not in agreement with. And to have such a dissenting perspective that George has, and to go public with it, when I say he's attacking him, it's not like the political attacks that we're seeing on TV in the States right now. It's maybe a little bit more subtle, maybe a little bit more above the belt, but this is about as unprofessional as it gets. And look, I'm here for it. You're here for it. Other people are here for it because, we do want to hear what the original source material creator has to say. And that's fair. But for him, in that world, from, in Hollywood, openly criticizing not just, your contemporaries, but, criticizing somebody that you're working kind of directly with who's adapting your source material. I mean, that's interesting. He never came after David Benioff and D.B. Weiss like this. And I know, that he's got strong opinions about how his original work, A Song of Ice and Fire, would ultimately conclude compared to that of Game of Thrones. He's written a blog post about that, how it's going to be much different from the show. And thank goodness, at least from my perspective, that's a good thing. But he starts talking about this butterfly effect, and he really leans into this, and he puts an emphasis on this little change, talking about, well, Maelor on his own is not significant, but that could create a huge change later if they don't do something different. And are they going to do something more interesting? Now, spoiler alert, and I should have spoiler signs up on the screen here, hopefully, but if not, listen to me, spoiler alert. He references Helena's death is going to occur in season 3 with none of the buildup, none of the trauma. And now if you look, what's interesting, he doesn't even talk about the characterization. He doesn't focus on how Daemon is much different than that in the books. Rhaenyra is very different from her character in the books. But Maelor, his death ultimately is the thing that triggers Helena to kill herself. Well, he suggests that nothing really dramatic happens based on the outline that he sees, that really there's no reason or there's no weight behind her killing herself. It just happens. And I think this goes in with a couple of other things with the way these characters are being developed, with the characterization. He emphasizes at the very end of this, not a blog, that there are some toxic moments or toxic butterflies that have greater impacts than that of Maelor missing. And now narratively, Maelor not being present, I don't know that that's such a huge ordeal. I think that what he is suggesting is Maelor creates the stir of the small folk, right? And when, he doesn't create the stir of the small folk, but when Maelor dies, he's brutally murdered by the small folk. They basically tear him to shreds. If you go back and read it, it's disgusting to read. And I don't want to see that. I don't think we need something like that to be visualized. Just like Blood and Cheese, I thought Blood and Cheese was okay because you get the point. And the idea is to communicate these ideas to the general audience, to more casual viewers who have not read the book. So I understand that change. If they did exactly what they did in the book, or exactly what George does in the book, that might be too harsh for fans that have no idea that this is coming or what they signed up for. That might be too much. Maelor's death, similarly, would have been too much, I think, for most general audiences. But the issue there is that if that's what triggers Helena killing herself, Helena's death also gets the small folk into an uprising and ultimately becomes the beginning of the end of Rhaenyra's reign in King's Landing. Not that it's very long lasting either way, but so he starts focusing on this butterfly effect and how that could negatively impact things. My point is this an attack on Ryan Condal? Is it an attack on House of the Dragon? Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how you could read it and think otherwise. But it also shows a dissent from Ryan Condal and George R. R. Martin, and that is very alarming. It's one thing that you look at some of these changes that are done, and this is just him focusing on, I think George initially had suggested that he was going to make multiple posts about the various problems with House of the Dragon. Now, me personally, I thought he was going to focus on the writer's strike. I thought he was going to focus on just the logistics of certain scenes not going to be able to translate from the book to the show. I can understand that. I thought that's where he was going to go. I thought he was going to focus on the budgetary restraints with the season being cut from 10 episodes down to 8 episodes. But what I'm actually seeing here is him fundamentally disagreeing with the creative decisions that are occurring within the writer's room for House of the Dragon. And that's concerning. What's even more concerning is that these conversations occurred between George R. R. Martin and Ryan Condal back in 2022, where he alludes to the idea that actually Maelor's he's absent for Blood and Cheese, but he is going to be brought back into the fold later on in season 3. Well, that obviously is not happening because he also says that Helena would have become pregnant in season 2. Well, if she's pregnant in season 2, we obviously didn't get that. Now, would have that been included in the episode 9 and 10 that were ultimately cut from the show? Maybe. I'm not sure. My concern is that George went really far into his concerns about the outlines that he has seen for House of the Dragon. He ended this blog speaking on these greater, more toxic butterflies, right? Maelor is one butterfly that has been changed and will change the trajectory of the rest of the show because he's missing. And yet he alludes to multiple other more significant butterflies that have changed, and we don't know what he's referencing. And I don't know that he'll ever make another update again. If he took the last one down, that suggests to me that he's not going to go through with this any further. That somebody said something to him. There was some sort of communication between him, Ryan Condal, probably not Ryan Condal, honestly. It was probably an executive with HBO that said, hey, if you do, like, you are negatively impacting the show, and there was probably some sort of agreement. Something was communicated one way or the other. George took the post down. I don't think we're ever going to get an elaboration on what he was hinting at with these greater toxic butterflies. But if just Maelor just missing got him in that much of a stir, it was a very long blog post. And yet that's just like the tip of the iceberg. At least that's what I think he's hinting at. Well, what else is there then? And is that not concerning for you? It's concerning for me. Now, if you're a more casual viewer, like, you probably don't care about any of this. And if you are a more casual viewer, I appreciate you watching or listening to a video like this. I thank you, but I do find it peculiar that you're here, because you might actually be having a really good time with the show. And please don't let the book fans ruin it for you. Don't even let the author of the source material ruin it for you. If you're enjoying it, enjoy it. You know, like, whatever, have at it. But for the book fans, I think this is a huge red flag. A couple of the other guys that I talked to, a couple other YouTubers that focus on A Song of Ice and Fire, they seem to be kind of up in arms about it. Now, if you're more interested, I think this has just been a perfect storm for it to be a disaster. I think stuff going on at the corporate level, at the top with Warner Brothers Discovery, plus the writer's strike, and then you see creatively they're making decisions that kind of counter George's philosophy, especially when writing characters. You can focus on the personal agency of certain characters like Damon. I think that is it definitely gets away from the spirit of who that character was, at least the portrayal of him in The Rogue Prince, The Princess and the Queen, and Fire and Blood. But you combine that with the issues with the studio, with Warner Brothers Discovery, and it just, the writer's strike, I just feel like season 2 just blew up in a really negative way for a lot of fans. And I think it was a perfect storm for that to happen. If you want to learn more about that, I would recommend that you check out the Dragon Demands. He's got a lot of insight that he uploads on his channel in regards to a lot of that stuff that's occurring at the corporate level, why we are down to 8 episodes instead of 10 episodes. I think that's kind of fascinating. But my biggest issue, outside of that, is, look, you are kind of losing some of the thematic elements that George R.R. Martin really likes to lean into and introduce. My problem with Prophecy is I don't like it being such a decisive thing, and that seems very anti-George R.R. Martin. So if you're going to adapt George R.R. Martin's material and then you're going to like stray away from what really makes it George R.R. Martin-esque, that seems kind of appalling to me. I know that I've been kind of criticized in my own comment section for having a negative outlook on this, like the book is the book, the show is the show. Should they pander only to the book readers instead of the show only viewers? And my response to that is maybe, because maybe if my issue is that if you look at George R.R. Martin, A Song of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, a lot of the people I talked to that got into this book series, they got into it because of Game of Thrones, especially the earlier seasons, and they ultimately didn't like where the show went. But they got into these books because of Game of Thrones, and I think it has attracted maybe more of a mainstream following for George's book series, which means I think people are finding the original material very compelling. People that maybe are not big readers, and look, to get through A Song of Ice and Fire, I mean, these are epic novels, and there's 5 of them that, I think the shortest one is A Game of Thrones, and it's still, I believe, around 700 pages. So these aren't easy books to just hop into, and yet more casual readers have found these pretty compelling and interesting. They like them. So that my thought about that is, should they pander to the book readers? Maybe, because something is drawing your more not even fantasy fans into this huge fantasy epic. Well, what is that? Well, I think it's something that resonates with people more universally. So to stray away from that, I don't know if that's really a good idea. Game of Thrones became very popular with much more faithful adaptations in season 1, 2, and 3, and they kind of make some changes there in season 4. But for the most part, those first 4 seasons, which are the most acclaimed by fans and critics alike, those seasons worked really well, and they were the most faithful adaptations. By season 5, all of a sudden something seemed to change, and it's because David Benioff and D.B. Weiss decided to do their own thing instead of faithfully adapting A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. So I don't want to hear that they are pandering to just the small minority of book fans, because that's what they did in the first 4 seasons, and the show took off and it became great. A Game of Thrones, I mean. So House of the Dragon, you've got so much creative freedom by expanding these characters. Again, the source material is very thin, but those key plot points are significant. So if you're going to stray away from those, you better replace it with something fantastic. And now you're being hit with these constraints with writer strikes and studio interference and budget cuts, things that are making it even more difficult to see your own vision realized, when you could have just stuck to the blueprint that was already outlined for you. They give you plenty of space to be creatively free with the ideas. I just feel that George R. R. Martin is kind of spot on with his attack. It's unprofessional. Look, there's an etiquette there, and I feel like he kind of crossed the line, and I think that explains why that blog post was taken down. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. I feel like people are going to be really split about this, especially show-only fans, because they're probably having a good time with it, and it's just whiny bitches like myself, that are losing their mind about it. But I'm kind of out on House of the Dragon as far as it being a faithful adaptation. It's a really high-quality fanfic, and I'm enjoying it from that aspect in a way. But it's not what I wanted. It's not what I think a lot of book fans wanted. And I don't think it's what George R. R. Martin wanted either. But let me know what you guys think. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. If you're enjoying the show, please keep enjoying the show. There's plenty of other things to be really upset about and angry and depressed. I'm not any of those things. I'm just a little disappointed in what this show turned out to be. But I hope that you are not. But if you are, let me know about it in the comment section.